look at the civil rights movement and the role of music there. So
Yeah.
what I'm doing is turning that around and using it intentionally. And I'm not saying that music wasn't used intentionally, but now that we know what's in there, right? And the aesthetic experience and the cognition, we can use it. And yeah, I tell my undergraduates when I'm doing this is that I'm giving you the kings of the kingdom. Raise your hand. I will only use this for good. Because, Big Pharma tried to hire me. And I was a little confused at first. And he said, he had actually been overhearing a conversation. And he said, you understand why people find things beautiful. Turn that around. You can help us do that. And I was like, is that why people should take pills? And when my mother was ill, I did see an array of beautiful pills. So they did it without me. But that idea of turning this around, and there is an ethical issue. And I couldn't do this in this environment now, but I have had my students read excerpts from Mein Kampf because Hitler understood this. And if only the evil people understand it, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's just, yeah, it's really powerful because, yeah, I think this is where, a lot of people trivialize aesthetics and beauty as, well, that's just sort of fluffy stuff. But if we don't pay attention to it, we don't realize how it's driving us, how it seduces us, how it can derail us, how it can manipulate us, and becomes incredibly important to understand.
They don't like it when I say this, but the whole American PR marketing machine came after World War II when people looked and said, how did he do that? Supposedly decent people did awful, horrific things. And you look at the way he used film, the way he used music. He did, very consciously so, to get, in his mind, get people to fall in love with him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, aesthetics can certainly be, I mean, that's the heart of propaganda. But you also say it could be a means of healing, and I know you've done some work on healing from trauma. Could you talk about some of that? I mean, how does it help us?
So a lot of the humanities talk about the aesthetic as a safe place, as a place to heal the wounded soul. And certainly, and I'm not being disrespectful when I say that the aesthetic has played an enormous role in religion. And you actually can see it in the Western church where the mainstream churches were beginning to lose parishioners to the Pentecostals because it was more emotionally exciting. And that's where the stained glass comes from. That's when the enormous choirs come in. The idea that they weren't trying to drive people away from spirituality. They were trying to pull them to spirituality. So, but the difference is one thing to describe it is another to kind of dig into it and start, I'm going to use the word dissecting to see what's happening. And so, the field of trauma therapy, of art therapy, first of all, it works whether you know how it works or why it works. So this is another one of my aborted ideas. And right now I'm in my career where I'm kind of going back and looking at these ideas and saying, can I make this work? Art in a box for kids in refugee camps, where a lot of times they were giving them plush toys. Well, if you're in a refugee camp, one more thing to try to keep clean that your kid loves is probably not the best thing to get.
Yeah.
But art in a box, children, give them crayon and paper and they will draw. And actually, I talked to somebody who had been a lost boy, and he said, you're going to have to get lots of red because what they do. And then during an epidemic, I was talking to some people and they said, we see children digging graves with sticks, pretending. And so those little toy shovels that you get in the summertime for kids. And so this idea that working, think about, they need lots of red. They see a lot of blood. They're rehearsing it. And what does rehearsal mean? It doesn't mean that they're becoming murderers. They're just trying to work through the trauma by, we've all been to plays or movies where there was something that spoke to us and we felt a little better. So there actually is healing in the art, and the art allows a different thing to happen. A graduate student who's now a professor, who did her dissertation with me, but this is her idea. I just kind of helped, do that advisory thing. She interviewed Black artists who, every time there's another police killing, we see those videos and we all feel something. And there's data already about how that's even more traumatic for Black people because That's just not like, oh, look at that. That
Yeah.
could be my son.
Yeah.
That could be me. And so what the artists were, she was surprised to find that the artists were self-consciously working as cultural workers, where they would watch the video, they would digest it, they would paint it so that people could look at it longer and come to some action. And she was kind of surprised that they were consciously doing it,
Yeah.
because we all know, and and this is very controversial in Black culture. Do you bear witness to every video? But at some point, it begins to affect your own mental health. And when is it okay to step away? But that's when the artist steps in, and you can see it, but it's abstracted enough that it doesn't impact you in quite the same way. There's something about the aesthetic that gives you a little distance, that gives you, and sometimes the ability to see more because you can see it more often. And the leader in this, I have to say, is Jackie Armstrong at the Met. The Met had, the Metropolitan Museum has an Office of Education. Most of her work is in the museum, but I'm very interested in taking this out into the world, and that's beginning to happen, to see, because you saw it during the worst of COVID, where when we made jokes about how streaming went up, how all kinds of aesthetic uses went up. People were self-medicating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You had also talked at our symposium a couple of months ago about this the experience of dance and how that was transformative for gang members. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So there are dancers who work with, I mentioned the Lost Boys in West Africa, and these are young fighters who are usually kidnapped and trained to carry out horrific atrocities. In order to do that, something called dissociation has to happen, where your emotions are really dissociated from what your body is doing. So you're not saying, I'm going to hack this person to death with a machete, and how do I feel about that? Your mind is not processing that. And it's not immediate. It takes a long time. Unfortunately, people have become experts at this. In some cases, lost boys have been rescued, but you can't just kind of say, have a nice life. And so you can spend, and therapy works, you can spend years and years of therapy. But what they found was that, first of all, you cannot dance. You cannot dance without that aesthetic coming into the space. And they found that happened. And when I was at the University of Maryland, we were bringing them in a kind of abstract way. And I said, but we have child soldiers in the United States. And it was Karen Bradley, who is the dance instructor. And she said, who? And I said, gang members, young gang members. Doesn't the same thing happen? And it took me a very long time to get the anti-gang unit to trust me, because, who's this obviously middle-class Black woman floating in saying, she wants to do this. And so they tested me in all kinds of ways. And finally, when they decided to, help us, they said, we're going to send you the girls because they're tougher than the boys. And they did. They sent us some very tough girls, and they sent counselors with them. And one young woman walked in and said, can I say this word? Can I say the B word on your podcast?
Sure. I mean, we might bleep it out.
Okay. She walked in, and she was physically very large, tall, and big. And she said, I'm the baddest in this room. And we can talk about why she felt she needed to say that. I kind of don't have time to go into that. And they began the exercise. Show me, because they were making a dance, show me a movement where you have hurt somebody. Now, the day before, that had freaked out the college students. But, these are young gang members. They could do a movement from when they had hurt somebody. But then they asked them, well, now let's do a movement where you have been hurt. Well, that's a whole nother thing. And that took a lot longer. Whereas the college students the day before, could tie into that. And so this same young woman left the circle a couple of times. And we had brought in college students that looked a certain way. No preppies, but people who had tattoos and piercings and, that sort of thing, blue hair. And the students have been trained to not try to pull people back in the circle, but just to go. Now, notice I just made an aesthetic training. They have to
Yeah.
look a certain way.
Yeah.
To just go and sit with people who would sit out. And, gradually they would come back into the circle, and they did a whole dance. And this woman who clearly was showing signs of, this is who I am. It happened to be Valentine's Day, and I was silly enough to, or unwise financially enough, to bring in roses. You know how expensive roses are on Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
And I was another aesthetic thing, and I'm handing out roses, and this woman comes over to me and hugs me, and cries. She had done the dance, and then she said, "Nobody's ever given me roses before." She was different. This was an hour and a half. Sometimes the aesthetic, I don't want to say force, because it always feels more gentle than that, or usually feels more gentle than that, did something that years of therapy also does. And so that idea that you get trauma healing, and now with the neuroscientists, we can begin to measure actually, the responses to the aesthetic. And so we have vastly underestimated the ability of the aesthetic to heal us, to help us move on, to help us imagine the next space, because it's a safe space. I have to say, I don't quite understand the larger society's stubbornness about this, why we continue to dismiss the muscle of beauty and the aesthetic. There's some, even as people use it in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, just because it just seems soft and trivial. And maybe it's because it doesn't force, maybe because it's gentle, but the dark side of that is also it could be insidious, right? But I think all the more reason for us to try to understand how it works. Talk about the Indigo Dye Initiative. I mean, that's a more recent project. And
yeah, well, it's ongoing right now. So Indigo starts in India, but it goes throughout Asia, West Africa, the Caribbean, driven in the 19th, well, really the 18th century by slavery. So in the United States, are the colonies at the time, indigo, natural indigo, which is used to make dye, was a slave crop. And that's important. So the natural indigo market, which was one of the top two exports of the colonial U.S., almost died out completely because of synthetic dyes. And there's a resurgence now in interest because it is natural, and it's one of the natural dyes. It's the most lucrative of the natural dyes because it's the rarest. And so in Baltimore, and it sounds weird because you hear indigo, you think South Carolina. Our former First Lady, Yumi Hogan, is Korean and grew up in Naju, Korea, same latitude as Baltimore. So she wanted to see first if it would just grow. And so she approached Micah, where she had been a student and an adjunct, to work with urban farmers to see if it would grow. We grew other types of natural dye, but indigo is the money crop, and grew different strains. And long story short, what that grew into is expanding. It came over to my shop to expand it with farmers on the Eastern Shore. We're not excluding farmers, but we're really directing a lot of this to Black farmers who are losing, have a history of discrimination by the lenders, losing Black farms at a rapid rate. Yeah. Maryland Eastern Shore with the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, which is HBCU. South Carolina Low Country, so on land that we know that slaves grew it before. And this summer, Virginia and North Carolina. What's important about that is most Black farmers in the U.S. are in these two regions of the Mid-Atlantic and the South. It comes back to Baltimore, where we hire, and we are the market. We give them the seed, which is hard to get, and then we come back and buy the indigo. Then we employ returning citizens to hang it and process it. And we have funding for a building and grinding machines and things like that. And then we're training artists with the lure of, we give you the indigo dye because they can't get it. It's hard to get. They can, but it's rare and expensive. There's only one other company in the United States that does industrial level indigo. And where the aesthetic comes in is in so many places. Indigo is sacred in all of those places. Yeah. And while we're not proselytizing, we honor that. One of my favorite things to do is that we, during the summer, do a Arab cart. So there's a horse-drawn cart. We load on vats of indigo dye, and we go through underserved communities and hand out cotton T-shirts. And Kabibi Ajanku, who's our indigo master teacher teaches them African-centric designs, and then they dye. And we hand out gloves, which they say, I want my hands blue. And then they do it, and I just watch. Adults report that they feel calmer without knowing the history of indigo, although we tell them a little bit that they feel calmer. There's just so many pictures of people just, this is more than like finger painting, that this is very important. But we're also creating, so what we're doing, and this is the hard part for somebody to understand, there are people who approach indigo purely for aesthetic, kind of what I'll call play aesthetic reasons. And there are other people who approach it, oh, wait a minute, this is an emerging world market. Because we did the economics, we're academics. We brought in another group that, then brought in economists. And so we know what the market's going to do over the next, both here and internationally. And the Arab card, Arab is a historic term for these. They were actually African-American vendors. There's a long history about why they're called Arabs. So we're bringing all of these things together, the market sophistication, the aesthetic, the spiritual. We have advisors who are venture capitalists, and they're not pushing to invest, but they're just advising us because this is really interesting. We're working with chemical engineers to optimize the particles. And so we started this conversation talking about bringing all of these things together, but at the core of it is that indigo is beautiful. The returning citizens, meaning that they've been in prison, there's a conversation of whether you bake it dry or you hang it dry. And they said, it's richer when you hang it. And I said, so what is richer? They said, it smells fuller. It looks fuller. We have more dye on our hands when we hang it. So even in the processing, there's aesthetics going on. And so the idea is to weave aesthetics through the entire process. And in some of the urban gardens, Upton Planning Committee, which is the community partner, in getting community members to think about allowing these fields in their neighborhoods, she showed them what the flowers look like. Because with indigo, if you have ever topped off a houseplant, that's what you do twice during the summer, sometimes 3. Then you let it bloom. And so there are these fields of magenta colored flowers. Then you let it go to seed and you collect the seed. So aesthetics isn't this thing that's here. Like our day-to-day lives, is woven through the whole thing in a project that is, the way we're designing it, feeding wealth back into the community, both as employees, but we're also working around with alternative type of shares. It might be just as simple as profit sharing, but we're looking at other models as well. And the whole idea is to raise the quality of life because it's pretty. And the building that has been purchased with the funding is an 1858 colored school, Harriet Beecher Stowe School. There are Harriet Beecher Stowe schools all over the country. And so it was a blighted building and we were restoring it, but also working with, there's an art district right there, certainly the only Black art district in Maryland, to train artists to create products for sale. Wow. So I'm kind of I don't know, my title keeps changing. And I'm kind of a doer in the middle of this.
But that's amazing to see because it has potential transformative effects on so many levels, right? At the individual level, as people are experiencing their hands turn color and then experiencing this sort of fullness.
Well, and I have to say that African Americans have been alienated from their work since slavery. And with this work, because it is so culturally meaningful, because it is beautiful, just watching people do the work, they're not alienated anymore.
Beauty at Work is brought to you by Templeton Religion Trust. If you enjoyed this clip, go check out the full episode. And please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks, and see you next time.